My name is Sophia. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with soft words: steady, reliable, low maintenance. I work a quiet professional job. I pay my bills on time. I don't raise my voice in rooms where other people like to be heard. If you asked my family to describe me, they'd probably say I'm the safe one, the one who doesn't cause trouble, the one who will always understand. What they usually don't say, what they rarely notice, is that calm is not the same thing as weakness, and silence is not the same thing as surrender. People have underestimated me for as long as I can remember. Not in a cruel way, not loudly. It's more subtle than that. They assume I'll adapt. They assume I'll absorb discomfort so others don't have to feel it. They assume that if I don't object immediately, I never will. And for a long time, they were right, at least on the surface. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or turning family into villains. It's about a slow, quiet shift that happened inside me when I realized how easily love can slide into entitlement and how dangerous it can be to confuse kindness with consent. I let my sister and her kids move in. She tried to have me evicted. That sentence alone sounds dramatic, but the truth unfolded far more quietly than you might expect. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no moment where everything exploded at once. What happened instead was a series of small decisions, made calmly, that led to an outcome no one else saw coming. At the center of it all was a piece of paper, official, cold, impersonal. The eviction notice had my name on it, not hers. When I first saw it, I didn't cry, I didn't panic, I just felt something settle into place. A kind of clarity that only arrives when you finally understand the rules of the game you've been playing without realizing it. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through how that moment came to exist, who I was to my family before any of this happened, the role I was silently assigned, the small cuts that didn't seem worth addressing at the time, and the way quiet observation can sometimes become the strongest form of control, not over other people, but over your own life. I'm telling this story honestly, not to dramatize my sister or paint myself as a hero, but to document what it feels like to stop negotiating your own worth behind closed doors. There are no sudden miracles here, no clever monologues, just patience, documentation, and the decision to stop explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. If you've ever been the person everyone leans on without asking how much weight you're carrying, if you've ever stayed quiet because it felt easier than being difficult, you might recognize parts of yourself in what comes next. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, too late, that someone else was making plans with your life because you never said no? To my family, I was never the loud sister or the fragile one. I wasn't the rebel, and I wasn't the favorite. I existed somewhere in between, useful, dependable, and largely unexamined. If there was a form that needed filling out, I'd handle it. If there was a conversation that needed calming down, I'd soften it. If something needed to be absorbed so everyone else could stay comfortable, it usually landed with me. I didn't resent that role at first. In fact, I built my identity around it. Being the capable one felt like security. It meant I was trusted. It meant I was needed. And when you grow up learning that love often arrives wrapped in responsibility, you don't question the cost. You just learn to carry it quietly. My sister Claire was always different. Where I was measured, she was expressive. Where I paused, she reacted. Life seemed to happen to her while it happened around me. Family gatherings naturally tilted toward her stories, her struggles, her emergencies. Mine were smaller, manageable. I learned early that mentioning them only made things awkward, so I stopped. By the time we were adults, the dynamic had settled into something unspoken but rigid. Claire needed help. I provided stability. Claire asked. I adjusted. No one ever sat down and assigned these roles, but everyone behaved as if they were permanent. When I bought my apartment, a modest 2-bedroom unit in a quiet building, it felt like a personal milestone. Not flashy, not impressive, just mine. I didn't announce it dramatically. I mentioned it once at dinner, and the conversation moved on. That was normal. My accomplishments rarely lingered in the air. To them, I was the sister who had things together, which I learned is another way of saying she can handle more. More noise, more inconvenience, more sacrifice. Because people who appear stable are rarely asked how much flexibility they actually have. When Claire and her kids eventually moved in, it didn't feel like a dramatic turning point. It felt like the natural extension of who I already was to them. Of course, I had space. Of course, I understood. Of course, it was temporary. Those words, of course, of course, of course, followed me everywhere like punctuation to my existence. What no one seemed to notice was how invisible I became inside my own home. Decisions were made around me, not with me. Schedules shifted. Boundaries softened. My preferences became suggestions, then inconveniences, then something no one remembered to ask about at all. And still, I stayed calm. I stayed reasonable. Because that's who I was to them. In family photos from that time, I'm always slightly off to the side. Smiling, but not quite centered. Present, but not commanding attention. At the time, I would have said that suited me. I liked peace. I didn't need control. But invisibility has a cost. And when you pay it long enough, people begin to assume it's free. I didn't know it then. But this was the foundation everything else would be built on, the assumptions, the oversteps, the quiet confidence they had that I would never push back. After all, I never had before. They thought they knew exactly who I was. And for a long time, I let them. The first moment I remember clearly wasn't loud. It didn't come with an argument or a raised voice. It was so small that if I described it to someone else, they might shrug and say I was overthinking. That's probably why it stayed with me. It happened about 2 weeks after Claire and the kids moved in. I came home from work later than usual that day, tired in the quiet, bone-deep way that doesn't ask for company. All I wanted was a shower and 10 minutes of silence before dinner. When I opened the door, I noticed my shoes weren't where I'd left them. They'd been pushed into the hall closet, slightly crooked like an afterthought. The living room was louder than normal. Toys scattered across the rug I used to keep folded neatly under the coffee table. The television was on, volume high, some animated show looping bright colors against the wall. Claire was on the couch, phone in hand, laughing at something I couldn't hear. She looked up briefly when I walked in. "Oh, good, you're back," she said, without standing. "Can you watch them for a minute? I need to make a call." It wasn't the request itself that bothered me. I loved my nieces and nephews. I'd agreed to help where I could. What stayed with me was the phrasing. Not "would you mind," not "are you tired?" Just an assumption that my time was available because I had entered the room. I hesitated, just a fraction of a second, long enough to feel something tighten in my chest. Then I nodded, set my bag down, and sat on the floor with the kids. Claire disappeared into my bedroom to take her call. I remember noticing the door close behind her. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost invisible, but it landed somewhere precise. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I mentioned, casually, that I'd been exhausted, and could we maybe check in before handing off childcare on weekdays? I kept my tone light, non-accusatory. The way women are taught to make requests is palatable. Claire sighed, not dramatically, just enough to signal inconvenience. "Sophia, I thought you understood the situation," she said. "I'm doing the best I can. I figured you wouldn't mind." There it was again. You wouldn't mind. Not that you didn't mind. As if my feelings were already decided for me. I remember nodding, again. I remember saying something like, "Yeah, okay, just thought I'd mention it." I even smiled to soften the moment, and just like that, the discomfort evaporated. For everyone except me. The next morning, the kitchen was a mess, dishes in the sink, crumbs on the counter. The kids' backpacks are blocking the hallway. None of it was extreme. None of it felt worth a confrontation. But as I cleaned up, I realized something unsettling. No one had asked if this was okay. They had simply settled in. At work that day, I wrote the date in my notebook. Just the date. No explanation. I'd always been a note-taker. Meetings, deadlines, observations. But that entry was different. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. A quiet way of saying, this mattered. That was the beginning of a pattern. Not cruelty. Not abuse. Just a steady erosion of courtesy, disguised as familiarity. Each moment is easy to dismiss on its own. Together, they formed something heavier. No one else noticed. And why would they? From the outside, it looked like generosity, family helping family, a sister stepping up. But I started to understand something important that week. The most damaging changes in a relationship don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, wrapped in reasonable explanations, and they rely on your silence to survive. I didn't say anything more. Not then. I told myself it was temporary, that I was being sensitive, that things would settle. But once you feel that first small cut, you don't forget where it landed. After that first moment, nothing dramatic happened. That's what made it so easy to ignore. Life didn't fracture all at once. It thinned, day by day, inch by inch, until the shape of my home no longer felt like it belonged to me. The small things started stacking up. My mornings changed first. I used to wake up early, make coffee, and sit by the window with my notebook before work. Once the kids were there, the apartment woke up before I did. Cereal bowls clinked in the sink, cartoons filled the air. Someone was always looking for something they couldn't find. I adjusted my routine without announcing it, because that felt easier than asking for quiet. Then came the comments. Not unkind, just dismissive in the way people get when they're comfortable taking. You don't really need the second bedroom, do you? Claire asked one evening, half joking, when I mentioned turning it back into an office. You're so good at handling this stuff, she said when bills or school forms came up. Must be nice not having kids, she added once, laughing, as if it were an advantage that balanced everything else out. Each sentence carried an assumption, that my needs were smaller, simpler, more flexible than hers. And every time, I let it pass. I told myself she was stressed, that this was a rough chapter for her, that families bend for each other. What I didn't realize was how quickly bending becomes expected. Soon, decisions were being made without me. Furniture shifted, cupboards reorganized, grocery lists rewritten. I'd come home and discover changes already in place, like my consent had been implied by my absence. When I hesitated or asked a question, Claire would look surprised, genuinely surprised, that I might want to be consulted. I didn't think you'd care, she'd say. Or worse, it's not a big deal. That phrase became the justification for everything. It's not a big deal that the kids used my desk for homework. It's not a big deal that my bedroom became the quietest place in the apartment. Until it wasn't. It's not a big deal that my name was still on all the paperwork while my authority slowly disappeared, and I helped normalize it. That part took me a long time to admit. I laughed things off, I minimized, I filled the silence when it stretched too tight. I didn't want to be the difficult sister. I didn't want to add pressure to an already unstable situation. I told myself that keeping the peace was a form of kindness, but peace built on self-erasure doesn't last. It just teaches people how much of you they can take. I started to feel like a guest in my own home, one with responsibilities but no real say. When friends asked how things were going, I gave vague answers. Busy. An adjustment. I didn't trust my own discomfort enough to name it. At night, after everyone was asleep, I'd sit at the kitchen table and open my notebook. I didn't write essays, just bullet points, dates, short phrases. Moved my files without asking, assumed I'd cover utilities this month, said I was lucky I didn't have kids. I told myself I was being dramatic, then I kept writing anyway. Looking back, this was the stage where disrespect stops feeling like a violation and starts feeling like the new normal. The danger isn't the behavior itself, it's how quickly your nervous system adapts to it, how your standards quietly lower to match what you're given. Everyone else adjusted easily, they were comfortable, settled, secure in the belief that I would continue absorbing whatever came next. And I did, for a while, because staying quiet felt safer than asking for something back. But silence, once normalized, doesn't disappear. It waits. It wasn't one single realization. It was a gradual clarity, like fog lifting just enough for me to see the outline of something that had been there all along. I wasn't just being taken for granted, I had been cast. In my family story, I played a very specific role. The reliable backdrop, the constant. The one whose presence made everyone else's chaos survivable. I wasn't the protagonist. I wasn't even a supporting character with agency. I was the setting. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The way conversations shifted when I entered a room told me everything. Plans were discussed as if I'd already agreed. We'll just do it at Sophia's. Sophia doesn't mind. Sophia can handle that. My name had become shorthand for problem solved. When I did try to speak up, gently, carefully, it was met with confusion rather than resistance. That was the most unsettling part. No one argued with me. They just looked surprised, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly expressed an opinion. You're usually so easygoing, Claire said once, brows knit when I mentioned needing a quiet evening. Not accusing, just baffled. Easygoing, that was the label. And labels, once assigned, become expectations. I realized then that my calm had been interpreted as consent. My patience is limited by availability. My silence is agreement. I had trained the people around me how to treat me, not through what I said, but through what I allowed to pass unchallenged. At work, I was respected. My boundaries were clear. Deadlines were honored. If something needed to change, it was discussed. I didn't apologize for existing there. The contrast made my home life feel disorienting, like I was living two different versions of myself depending on who was watching. At home, I was the buffer, the fallback plan, the quiet solution. No one felt guilty using because I never made it uncomfortable. I started noticing how often my sister framed her needs as emergencies and mine as preferences. Emergencies override preferences. That hierarchy became an unspoken law in the apartment. What hurt wasn't just the imbalance, it was how invisible it was to everyone else. If I brought up feeling overwhelmed, it was reframed as stress. If I mentioned boundaries, they were treated as temporary inconveniences. No one saw a pattern because acknowledging it would require admitting that they benefited from it. So instead, the role stayed intact. One night, standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, but composed. Capable, fine. The kind of woman people assume doesn't need protecting, even from her own family. That's when it hit me. As long as I stayed in this role, nothing would change. Not because anyone was malicious, but because the system worked too well for everyone else. Roles don't dissolve on their own. They persist until someone refuses to play them. I haven't refused yet, but I stopped pretending I didn't know what part I'd been given. And that knowledge, quiet, steady, unsettling, was the beginning of something shifting inside me. The day everything changed didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no sharp words exchanged, no moment anyone else would remember. That's how I know the shift was real. It happened entirely inside me. It was a Saturday morning. Rain pressed softly against the windows, the kind of gray Portland day that usually made me slow down. I'd planned to spend the morning reorganizing paperwork, boring, methodical work that soothed me. Instead, I woke up to noise. The kids were running down the hallway. Claire was on the phone, voice tense, pacing back and forth. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening, waiting for the familiar question, "Can you?" It came right on cue. "Sophia," Claire called, already distracted. "Can you take them for a bit? I need to deal with this." Something about the timing landed differently. Maybe it was the way my name was used like a button to be pressed. Maybe it was how automatic it all felt. I sat up, feet on the floor, and noticed my hands were steady. "I can for an hour," I said. My voice sounded calm, normal. Claire nodded, already moving on. "No, thank you. No acknowledgement of the limit I just set." I watched the kids, made breakfast, and wiped counters. At the end of the hour, I gently reminded her I needed to step away. She frowned, not angry, just inconvenienced. "Already?" she said. "Okay, I guess." That was it. That was the moment. Not because she resisted, but because she didn't hear me. The boundary existed only in my mouth, not in her mind. And I understood then that clarity spoken once doesn't change a dynamic built over years. Later that afternoon, I sat alone at the table with my notebook open. I didn't write immediately. I just looked at the pages I'd filled over the past weeks. Dates, patterns, evidence of something I'd been feeling but not naming. I felt an unexpected calm. Not resignation, not anger, decision. I realized I wasn't waiting for them to understand me anymore. I was waiting for myself to stop explaining. That was the shift. I stopped framing my needs as requests. I stopped softening my voice to make space for other people's comfort. I stopped hoping that if I was patient enough, someone would notice the imbalance and correct it for me. Instead, I asked a quieter, more important question. What am I actually responsible for here, and what am I not? That afternoon, I began separating facts from feelings, ownership from assumption, legal from emotional. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a change. I just observed, and for the first time, I didn't rush to smooth over the discomfort that observation created. Nothing outward changed that day. Dinner was eaten, dishes were done. The apartment went to sleep like it always did, but inside me, something fundamental had moved. I no longer felt confused about what was happening. I understood the structure I was inside, and that meant I could choose how to exit it, quietly, on my terms. After that day, my silence changed texture. Texture. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit shaped by years of smoothing things over. Now it was intentional. I wasn't withholding out of fear or exhaustion. I was choosing not to fill the space anymore. And that difference mattered. I still spoke when necessary. I was polite, cooperative. But I stopped volunteering explanations. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't voiced. I stopped translating tension into comfort for everyone else. At first, no one noticed. That's the thing about people who rely on your emotional labor. They rarely see it until it's gone. When Claire complained about being overwhelmed, I listened without offering solutions. When she hinted that she needed help, I waited for a direct ask. When she forgot to replace groceries I'd paid for, I didn't quietly restock them. I wrote it down. This wasn't punishment, it was accurate. I began treating my home like a shared space, governed by facts, not feelings. Who paid for what? Who used which room? Who decided what? I wasn't cold, I was clear. The kids adjusted easily. Children always do when the rules are consistent. It was the adults who struggled. Claire became restless, unsettled by the absence of my automatic compliance. She asked if I was okay more than once, her tone hovering between concern and suspicion. "I'm fine," I said. Old system. What she couldn't name was the loss of something she'd never acknowledged using. My predictability. The certainty that I would step in before being asked. The comfort of knowing I'd absorb whatever friction came next. My notebook filled faster during this period, but my emotions didn't. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't rehearsing confrontations. I was watching. I noticed how often decisions were framed as temporary, while becoming permanent through repetition. How often my sister spoke about our place without ever asking what that meant. How confidently she spoke to others about staying long-term while never saying it directly to me. And I noticed something else. When I stopped cushioning reality, people revealed their assumptions very quickly. One evening, Claire mentioned, casually, that she'd told a friend they might be staying for the foreseeable future. She said it like it was a neutral fact. I nodded, said nothing. But that night, I pulled out my lease documents. Silence, I learned, doesn't always de-escalate. Sometimes it creates space for truth to surface. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was gathering clarity. And clarity has a way of making people uncomfortable, especially when they've benefited from your confusion. By the end of that month, my silence was no longer invisible. It was noticeable in what I didn't fix, didn't smooth, and didn't absorb. And still, no one asked the right questions. They mistook my calm for acceptance. Again, what they never noticed was how methodical I've always been. They saw calm and assumed passivity. They saw patience and assumed delay. They didn't see the way my mind works when something no longer feels safe, how it slows down, how it catalogs, how it prepares. While everyone else settled into routine, I started paying attention to structure. Not emotions, not intentions. Structure. I reread my lease line by line one evening after work, highlighter in hand. Not because I expected trouble, but because I needed to know exactly where I stood if it ever arrived. I looked up local tenancy laws. Not in a panic, but with the same curiosity I'd bring to a work project. I bookmarked pages, took notes, cross-referenced clauses. I learned which agreements required written consent, which didn't. What constituted residency, what didn't. The difference between a guest, an occupant, and a tenant wasn't emotional, it was legal. And that distinction mattered far more than anyone realized. I began documenting timelines more carefully. When Claire started receiving mail at my address, when utilities spiked, when verbal, temporary arrangements stretched past reasonable definitions, I wasn't building a case against her. I was building a record for myself. At the same time, I made subtle internal changes. I separated my finances more clearly. I stopped fronting costs without reimbursement. I kept receipts. I didn't announce any of it. I just stopped blurring lines. The irony is that from the outside, nothing looked wrong. Family dinners still happened. The kids still laughed. Claire still spoke about stress, survival, and doing her best. And I still listened. What no one noticed was how little I reacted anymore. When Claire complained about instability, I didn't reassure her. When she hinted at long-term plans, I didn't agree or disagree. When she spoke around me instead of to me, I let the silence sit. People are used to others filling gaps. When you don't, they reveal what they assumed would be there. One afternoon, I overheard Claire on the phone saying, "It's basically my place now. We've been here long enough." She didn't say it to me. She said it like a fact that the world had already accepted. I wrote that down too. There was no adrenaline in this phase, no sense of plotting. It felt closer to grief, the kind where you finally stop arguing with reality and start responding to it. I realized then that preparation isn't loud. It doesn't require confrontation or threats. It requires patience and clarity, and the willingness to let people keep believing what benefits them. They thought my silence meant I wasn't paying attention. In truth, it meant I was paying attention to everything. The reveal didn't come with a rush of triumph or a dramatic intake of breath. It arrived quietly, on a weekday evening, after the apartment had gone still. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, documents spread out beside me. The kids were asleep. Claire was in her room, door closed, television murmuring softly behind it. The ordinary sounds of a shared space, nothing tense, nothing urgent. And yet something clicked. I had been comparing timelines, nothing more than dates and definitions. When temporary occupancy becomes something else. When permission is implied versus granted. When responsibility shifts, legally, from one person to another. It wasn't a secret loophole or a clever trick. It was simply the law, written plainly, waiting to be read without emotion. That's when I saw it. Everything. Every document, every contract, every obligation led back to one name. Mine. The lease, the utilities, the legal responsibility for the unit. Not hers, no matter how long she stayed. No matter how settled it felt. No matter how confidently she spoke about the place as if it belonged to her. I was the only one withstanding. And that realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel still. Because clarity doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes it brings responsibility, the kind that asks what you're willing to tolerate now that you know the truth. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, not imagining confrontations, not rehearsing explanations, just letting the knowledge settle into my body. This wasn't about catching her out. It wasn't about winning anything. It was about understanding that the narrative everyone else was operating under wasn't the one that actually governed my life. There's a strange loneliness in realizing you are the only one playing by the real rules. I didn't tell anyone what I'd learned. I didn't hint. I didn't change my behavior dramatically. I just stopped doubting myself. And that, I learned, is its own kind of shift. From that moment on, every interaction felt different. Not because my sister knew something had changed, but because I did. I no longer wondered whether I was being unreasonable. I no longer questioned whether I was allowed to protect my space. I knew exactly where I stood. And once you have that kind of clarity, pretending otherwise becomes impossible. I didn't act right away. I didn't need to. The information wasn't a weapon. It was a compass. It told me which options were real and which ones were just emotional noise. For the first time since my sister moved in, I slept deeply that night. Not because things were resolved, but because I finally understood them. Knowing something and acting on it are very different experiences. Once the truth was clear, I didn't feel rushed. I felt deliberate. Every option was suddenly visible, laid out in front of me like clean lines on a page. I could confront Claire directly, lay everything out, demand boundaries, force a conversation she'd been avoiding. I could give her a deadline and hope she took it seriously. I could continue as things were, armed with knowledge, absorbing the cost quietly. Or I could choose an option that didn't require her understanding at all. That was the one that stayed with me. I asked myself a simple question. What outcome would protect me even if nothing else changed? Because relying on someone else's cooperation is still a form of dependence. And I was done depending on goodwill that had never been guaranteed. The hardest part wasn't choosing myself. It was letting go of the need to be seen as fair by people who benefited from my uncertainty. I sat with that for days, not agonizing, measuring. I paid attention to my body when I imagined each path. Confrontation brought tension, but no resolution. Ultimatums brought guilt. Doing nothing brought a familiar heaviness I'd learned to live with, but no longer wanted to. The irreversible option felt different, quiet, solid, unemotional. It didn't punish anyone. It didn't require explanations. It simply acknowledged reality and moved accordingly. Once I chose it, something surprising happened. The internal debate stopped. No more looping thoughts. No more rehearsed conversations in the shower. The decision existed, and that was enough. I didn't announce it. I didn't signal a change. I continued living as I had. Polite, observant, restrained. But internally, I had crossed a line. From that point on, everything I did aligned with one principle. I am responsible for my life, not for maintaining other people's comfort at my expense. That choice didn't make me cold. It made me precise. And precision, I learned, is far more powerful than anger. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. I felt alignment. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet dominance. It isn't fueled by adrenaline or rage. It's fueled by certainty, and certainty doesn't rush. I began moving the way I always had, calmly, methodically, but now every action had direction. The first thing I did was stop reacting to the household and start tracking it. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just accurately. I updated my notebook every evening with neutral facts. Dates, changes, expenses, and statements overheard. No adjectives, no interpretations. Just reality, preserved before anyone could rewrite it later. At the same time, I made my life smaller on the surface. I declined extra responsibilities at work so my evenings were free. I cooked simpler meals. I spent more time in my room with the door closed. Not pointedly, not dramatically, just enough to reassert that it was still mine. When Claire commented on it once, "You've been really busy lately," I smiled and said, "Yeah, just focusing on a few things." That wasn't a lie. Behind the scenes, I started separating systems that had slowly merged without my consent. I rerouted my mail, updated digital addresses, changed how shared expenses were paid so nothing passed through my account by default. I stopped being the invisible infrastructure that made everything run smoothly. People notice chaos immediately. They notice the order only when it disappears. Claire started misplacing things. Bills were late. Small inconveniences cropped up, the kind that used to resolve themselves because I handled them quietly. She grew tense, restless, as if something essential had gone missing. But she couldn't name what it was. She didn't connect it to me, that was the point. I also started having very specific conversations with people who weren't in the apartment. A tenant advisory service, a legal clinic, a housing counselor. I didn't frame it as a crisis. I framed it as due diligence. Hypothetical, I said more than once, just understanding my position. They were clear, calm, unemotional. What mattered wasn't intention. What mattered was documentation. Authority, names on paper. Each conversation confirmed what I already knew. The structure favored whoever stayed quiet and prepared, not whoever spoke the loudest. The most important thing I did during this time was nothing that looked like escalation. I didn't confront Claire about long-term plans. I didn't correct her when she referred to the apartment as ours. I didn't challenge the story she told herself or others. I let her continue believing that time alone would legitimize her position. That belief made her careless. She started pushing further. not dramatically, just incrementally, talking about enrolling the kids in nearby programs, mentioning how stable the location was for them, saying things like, "It would be really disruptive to move again." I listened, I nodded, I wrote it down. There's a particular kind of confidence people develop when they think the ground beneath them is settled. They stop checking, stop asking, stop negotiating. They assume, and assumptions are fragile things. Meanwhile, I was doing the opposite. I was verifying everything. I confirmed notice requirements. I confirmed procedures. I confirmed what constituted proper communication and what didn't. None of this required secrecy. It required restraint. At home, the energy shifted subtly, not toward conflict, toward imbalance. Claire felt it, I think. She grew more insistent without being explicit, more emotional, less precise. She talked about fairness and family and how hard things had been. I didn't argue with any of it, because feelings don't override structure. One evening, she said something that crystallized everything. "I mean, you wouldn't actually do anything that would hurt the kids," she said, half laughing, half serious during a casual conversation about stress. I looked at her, really looked at her, and understood the final assumption she was operating under, that my morality would always be her safety net, that no matter how far things went, I would absorb the consequences so she wouldn't have to. I said nothing, just nodded once. That night, I finalized my timeline. I didn't feel cruel, I felt resolved. The next steps were procedural, administrative, boring even, which is often how the most consequential actions look from the inside. Paperwork was submitted. Notices were drafted. Not sent yet, just prepared. Dates were marked. Options narrowed. I wasn't waiting for the right moment. I was creating conditions where the moment wouldn't require emotion to execute. What's important to understand is this. At no point during this phase did I feel like I was betraying anyone. I felt like I was returning responsibility to where it belonged. Responsibility for my home. Responsibility for my stability. Responsibility for the consequences of choices, mine and theirs. Claire still thought nothing was happening. She still thought time was on her side, and that was the quietest advantage of all. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They don't announce themselves with certainty or clarity. Most of the time, they arrive in confusion. That's how it began. The first thing Claire noticed was the inconvenience. Not injustice, not a threat, just small disruptions that no longer resolve themselves. A late fee on a bill she assumed I'd covered. A return package because the name didn't match the mailbox anymore. A conversation with the building manager that felt shorter and more formal than she expected. She mentioned these things casually at first, like loose threads she expected me to tie up. "Do you know why this came back? Did you talk to management about the parking pass? They said they needed something in writing. Can you believe that?" I listened. I didn't correct her. I didn't intervene. For the first time, the systems she'd leaned on were asking her for clarity. And she didn't have it. Her frustration grew, but it didn't point outward yet. It turned inward, then sideways. She became sharper with the kids, quieter with me, more defensive in conversations that hadn't been confrontational at all. People feel lost before they understand it. What she was losing wasn't the apartment. Not yet. It was certain. The invisible scaffolding that had made her feel safe without ever having to secure it. She began trying to reassert control in subtle ways, reminding me how hard things had been for her. Talking, loudly, about how much stability the kids needed, dropping comments about family sticking together when others were around. It wasn't manipulation in the dramatic sense. It was reflex. A person reaching for the tools that had always worked before. But the tools were hitting air. I noticed how often she used we when talking to outsiders. "We've been here a while. We're basically settled. We're just waiting for things to finalize." Finalize what exactly was never specified, because she assumed finalization was inevitable. I stayed neutral, not distant, neutral. That neutrality unsettled her more than resistance ever would have. Resistance can be argued with. Neutrality just stands there, unmoved. The kids sensed the tension before she did. Children always do. They asked more questions. They hovered closer to her. The apartment felt tighter, not louder, like everyone was holding their breath without knowing why. One evening, Claire tried a different approach. She cooked dinner, something elaborate, set the table, poured wine. She talked about memories from when we were younger, times I'd helped her, moments she framed as proof of our bond. I listened. I ate. I didn't interrupt. Then she said carefully, "You know we couldn't do this without you, right?" There it was, the acknowledgement I'd waited years for. And for the first time, it meant nothing. I said, not dismissive, just non-committal. Her smile faltered for half a second. That's when I understood something important. She wasn't afraid yet. She was confused. The rules had changed, but no one had told her. And people don't panic when they think they're still safe. They panic when the safety net fails publicly. The next week, a letter arrived. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't addressed to her. It was official, yes, but procedural. The kind of communication that doesn't care about stories or intentions. I opened it alone. Read it once, then again. The eviction notice had my name on it, not hers. Not because I was being removed, but because I was the only one legally positioned to receive it. It was a notice of responsibility, of record, of standing. It clarified something no one else had bothered to clarify. There was no shared claim here, no ambiguity, no we, just me. I didn't show it to Claire. Not yet. That evening, she came home agitated. Management is being weird, she said. They asked if I was authorized to be here long term. I met her eyes calmly. What did you tell them? She hesitated. That we'd been here a while. That it was basically settled. Basically. I nodded. Okay. That was all? Her confusion deepened into unease. She started making calls, sending emails, asking questions she should have asked months ago. The tone in the apartment shifted again, this time toward instability. She wasn't losing the apartment yet. She was losing the illusion that it had ever been hers. And once that illusion cracked, everything built on it began to tremble. Panic doesn't arrive loudly at first. It tries reason. That's what Claire did once the questions stopped being abstract and started having names attached to them. Policies, procedures, timelines, words that don't bend just because someone is scared. At first, she told herself it was a misunderstanding. They're just being overly formal, she said one morning, pacing the kitchen with her phone in hand. I mean, we've been here months. That has to count for something. I didn't contradict her. I poured my coffee and listened. Then she moved to bargaining, with me, without quite realizing it. Maybe we should all sit down and talk to them together, she suggested. Maybe if you email them and explain the situation. They don't really understand how hard this would be on the kids. Each suggestion assumed something crucial, that I would step in and translate emotion into outcome, like I always had. But it was already too late for that. Because systems don't respond to urgency, they respond to structure. And structure had been ignored for too long. The emails she sent went unanswered longer than she expected. When responses did come, they were brief, polite, firm, requests for documentation she didn't have. She started sleeping poorly. I could hear her moving around at night, whispering on the phone in the hallway, trying to sound calm while asking increasingly frantic questions. What do you mean it's not automatic? But we live here. Yes, but we've been here a while. Doesn't that matter? It mattered emotionally. It didn't matter legally. That's when regret appeared. Not the clean kind, but the defensive kind that tries to rewrite the past. She began referencing conversations that had never happened, agreements that were never made explicit, moments she framed as promises instead of assumptions. You said it was fine, she told me one evening, voice tight. I said it was temporary, I replied gently. The word temporary hung between us, heavier than it ever had before. Her tone shifted then, from confusion to fear. She started crying unexpectedly, apologizing vaguely, saying things like, I didn't realize you felt this way, as if feelings were the issue. But this wasn't about feelings anymore. This was about the fact that no corrective action she could take now would undo months of inaction. No apology could retroactively create consent. No amount of panic could replace preparation. She tried urgency next. We need to fix this now, she said. Like, now. I nodded. You should talk to a housing advisor. That's it? She asked, incredulous. That's all you're going to say? It wasn't cruelty, it was accurate. I watched her scramble, calling friends, asking for favors, looking for shortcuts that didn't exist. Every solution required something she didn't have: time, leverage, standing. She asked me once quietly, late at night, why didn't you say something sooner? I answered honestly, I did, just not loudly. That was the moment I saw the full weight of it settle on her. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a consequence chain, and every link had been forged by assumptions she never checked because she believed my silence would protect her. By the time she fully understood that it wouldn't, there was nothing left to renegotiate. Too late to reset boundaries, too late to redefine roles, too late to rely on goodwill. What hurt the most, for both of us, was that none of this required malice to happen. Just entitlement meeting patience, unchecked, until patience ran out. The apartment felt different then. Smaller, sharper, as if the walls themselves had stopped accommodating the story she'd been telling herself. She wasn't angry at me, not really. She was angry at the time. And time, unlike people, does not apologize. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontations are supposed to happen. There was no raised voice, no accusations thrown back and forth. No dramatic list of grievances was finally unloaded after months of restraint. When it came, it was almost quiet. So quiet that if someone had walked past the apartment door, they might not have realized anything irreversible was happening inside. It was late afternoon. The kids were out with a friend. The apartment was still in a way it rarely was anymore. Claire sat at the table, shoulders slightly hunched, a stack of printed emails in front of her, like evidence she hadn't yet learned how to interpret. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. I need to understand what's happening, she said. Not sharply, just plain. Because I feel like I'm missing something. I sat across from her, not across the room, not standing. I wanted the physical arrangement to match the tone. Equal, calm, contained. You are, I said, but not in the way you think. She waited. That was new. So I spoke carefully, not to defend myself, and not to convince her, just to state facts that no longer needed cushioning. I agreed to let you stay temporarily, I said. I didn't agree to shared tenancy. I didn't agree to open-ended plans. And I didn't agree to being responsible for outcomes I wasn't consulted on. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. I thought, she started. I know, I said gently. That's part of the problem. She bristled at that, just slightly. You never said no. No, I agreed. I didn't. I assumed being clear once was enough. I assumed respect would fill in the gaps. Her eyes dropped to the papers. I didn't realize it had gotten this serious, she said. That's because it never felt serious to you, I replied. It felt stable. That landed. She rubbed her hands together slowly like she was cold. So what happens now? I didn't hesitate. Hesitation invites negotiation, and negotiation was no longer on the table. Now, I said, you make plans based on your actual standing, not what you hoped it was. She looked up, startled. You're not going to help me? I considered the question, not emotionally, precisely. I already have, I said, just not in the way you want. There was a long pause after that, not awkward, just heavy. She asked then, quietly, do you hate me? The question caught something in my chest, not sharply, but deeply. No, I said. If I hated you, I would have exploded months ago. I would have said things I couldn't take back. I didn't. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. What I won't do, I continued, is pretend this is about misunderstanding or bad luck. It's about boundaries that weren't respected because they were never enforced. She looked like she wanted to argue, to explain, to soften the moment with emotion, but something in my tone must have told her it wouldn't change anything. So that's it, she said. That's it, I confirmed. No victory, no satisfaction, just finality. When she stood up, it wasn't dramatic. She gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and said, I need some air. After she left, I stayed at the table for a long time. Not shaking, not relieved, just present. Confrontation doesn't have to be loud to be complete. Sometimes the calmest conversations are the ones that leave no room for reinterpretation. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't defended my character. I had simply refused to continue carrying what was never mine to hold. And for the first time, that was enough. After everything settled, not emotionally, but structurally, I expected to feel something dramatic. Relief, triumph, sadness. Something that would mark the end of what had been such a long internal process. What I felt instead was quiet, not emptiness, not numbness, just a steady calm that didn't require explanation. The apartment slowly returned to a shape that felt like mine again. Not immediately, not ceremonially. There were still echoes of shared routines, traces of noise in places that had once been silent. But they faded, not because I erased them, but because I no longer built my life around accommodating them. The most noticeable change wasn't in my surroundings. It was in how I moved through the world. I stopped over-explaining myself. At work, in friendships, in family conversations. When I said no, I didn't follow it with justification. When I said yes, it was deliberate, not automatic. People adjusted quickly. The ones who respected me always had. The ones who didn't drifted slightly farther away, confused by the absence of access. I noticed how often I'd mistaken tension for danger. How I'd been taught that discomfort, especially someone else's, was something I was responsible for fixing. That belief had shaped so many of my choices, long before my sister ever moved in. Now, when discomfort appears, I let it sit. Not coldly, honestly. Discomfort is information. It tells you where boundaries exist, whether you acknowledge them or not. I'm still calm, still reflective, still the woman people describe as steady. But there's a difference now. My calm doesn't invite overreach anymore. It doesn't signal availability. It signals awareness. Family gatherings feel different. I'm present, but no longer positioned as the solution to unspoken problems. When conversations drift toward assumptions, I redirect them with a sentence, not a sigh. When expectations surface that don't align with reality, I address them early, or I let them fail on their own. There's no bitterness in this, just clarity. I don't need to prove what I'm capable of by sacrificing myself. I don't need to earn belonging by being useful. And I don't need to be understood by everyone to trust my own decisions. If there's a loss here, it's the loss of an old identity, the one that kept me safe by staying small. Letting go of her wasn't cruel, it was necessary. I still love my sister. I always will. Love, I've learned, doesn't mean absorbing consequences on someone else's behalf. Sometimes it means allowing reality to do what it does best. Teach. Who I am now isn't louder, isn't it harder, isn't colder. I'm simply no longer invisible. And that might be the most durable kind of change there is. When I look back on everything now, what stands out isn't the paperwork or the conversations or even the moment I finally understood my position. What stands out is how quietly it all happened. There was no villain arc, no dramatic reversal where someone was exposed and shamed, no moment where I stood taller because someone else was finally smaller. If you were watching from the outside, you might have missed the entire thing. And that's important, because real power rarely looks like performance. This story isn't about winning. It's about responsibility. For a long time, I believed being good meant being flexible. Being loving meant being accommodating. Being strong meant absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to face it. Those beliefs weren't malicious, but they were incomplete. And incompleteness, left unchecked, can quietly hollow you out. What I learned is this. Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness. It's self-erasure. Silence without intention isn't peace. It's permission. I didn't change who I was. I stopped abandoning myself to preserve an image others found convenient. There's a particular kind of moral clarity that comes when you realize you didn't act against anyone. You simply acted for yourself. That clarity doesn't require applause. It doesn't need validation. It just settles in and stays. I didn't ruin my sister's life. I didn't punish her. I didn't weaponize love or law. I allowed reality to assert itself after I stopped shielding her from it. And I'm okay with that, because adults are not harmed by consequences. They are defined by how they respond to them. If there's a lesson here, it isn't, don't help family. It's this, help without disappearing. Support without surrendering authorship over your own life. Love without rewriting the rules of reality to protect someone from discomfort. The eviction notice had my name on it, not hers. Not because I was being removed, but because responsibility had always been mine, and I finally chose to wield it consciously. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself when no one is watching, when there's no applause, when the only witness is your own integrity. And once you choose that, you don't need to announce it. People feel it. Before we end, I wanted to leave you with a question. Not a rhetorical one, but a real one, meant to linger. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace, only to realize later that the peace was costing you yourself? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear how. Share your thoughts in the comments, your experiences, your reflections, or even where you're still unsure. These conversations matter, especially for those of us who learn to survive by being easy. Thank you for listening.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.